How's it going, everyone? Last time we showed you how to turn your classes into functions. Today we're going to take that a step further and show you how to turn your classes into attributes. So how do we do that? Well, we use in Python what's called the _get method. And what this does really is it turns your class into what we call a data descriptor. Now, this is a form of lazy loading your attributes or your data. This is very similar if you're aware of what the property method is in your classes. This is just a different way essentially of doing the same thing. There are some slight differences, but basically if you know what that is, it's very similar. So one reason you may want to use this is because it's what they call lazy loading. So if you normally you may have a class that loads all its attributes in, and then you can retrieve those attributes as you need them, but they're never going to recalculate unless you build a function to do that or a method. With lazy loading, your actual attribute will not be loaded or processed until you call it. So I can build my class and I may have an attribute that I only call sometimes, but that attribute takes a fair amount of time to actually load every time. So if I don't need that attribute in this instance of using that class, well, then I shouldn't have to waste all that time and memory on that one attribute. But also, if I want that attribute to keep loading live, well, every time I call it, it's going to be the live up-to-date version of that attribute, which can also be very beneficial. So how we're going to implement that today is with the get _ method. And over on the right, you can see that all it is a class. You define the get method, and that get method, well, because it's a class, as always, it takes self. It takes a second parameter, or well, essentially a first parameter, instance, which is actually going to be the instance of the class you're using it in, and we'll show you that in a sec. And the owner, which is the class that you're calling it from. Now you can see right down here that I'm actually using this, so hours, right? And if I run this, you'll notice that it'll just return 10. It won't return the class object of hours as you may think it would, but it's actually going to return 10. So I'll show you that here now. And you see it returns 10. So it is essentially just this class, because it has the get method, it actually, Python converts the class into what is called a data descriptor. And as soon as you call upon it, and it can only be called from within a class, I can't do this outside of a class, and it has to be a class attribute. It cannot be an instance attribute. So what the actual instance here is doing is it knows that this is referring to the instance of which I'm calling it. So it knows that it's part of the Michael instance. So if I make a second instance, this instance is the other instance. It's separate to the instance, but now the owner is class based. So it'll know it's a manager. We'll show you that right now. So for example, if I have in it, oh, I don't like when it does that. But let's say, for an example, if I did self dot employee ID, right? Okay, let's add in an employee ID. ID equals emp ID. Okay, so now I'm going to pass that in here, right? Okay. Now, what I can actually do, and you'll see this still works, what I can actually do now is from within this hours data descriptor or get method, I can actually see attributes from within this instance. So you'll see if I print it out, print instance dot emp ID, and prove it's from the get method, we'll just add a little comment here. Right? And now look, get, and it gets in, and it actually sees what the employee ID is. Now, one way to see the difference here is if I print the instance and the owner, right? It'll show me the actual ID, right? So you'll notice how the instance has a memory space, but the owner is literally just the manager class, right? So if I do instance, this is the actual instance. Anyways, so what we can do from there is now we know that we're getting the attribute, and this is what we're returning. Now, if we wanted a live update, right? Well, we have the employee ID here, and we know how we can now retrieve that information from in our get method. So if we have our makeshift database up here, which is the hours worked based on the ID, right? Well, all I need to do is pass this in, as you see here. And now we can get our corresponding ID, or our hours worked, sorry. And you can see that there. Let me just run this again. So you can see we have Michael's ID, and we get his hours of 4 hours. And if I was to keep changing this, imagine if this was just constantly updating, right? Every time it somehow switched, and then, oh, now it's 5, right? And I would get constantly up to date every time. Again, this isn't live, but you can imagine that literally every time. You know what? I'll do this. You can imagine this to try and emphasize the live update of this. What I'll do is I'll constantly switch this to something else. And then you'll see how it'll always keep updating. Now, we're not printing any of these. We're only printing Michael's hours, right? And then watch. Boom, 4, 5, 6. It keeps it up to date, and we didn't print it again, but you get the point. It keeps it up to date, and I think that's one thing that's important to realize with this kind of method, is that lazy loading can be very beneficial. There are other benefits, but that's one of the main ones to focus on right now. Anyways, that's it for today. Next, we're going to do the set method. I'm going to see you in the next video.